Hey guys, I'm Vadim with MaxTech, and as you probably know, there's some drama going on with the M2 MacBook Pro, so I think it's time to turn off the teleprompter, no script, straight from my heart, explain the entire situation so you can get a better understanding of what's going on, as well as make some changes on my end. So with that said, let me get into this explanation. There has recently been a lot of people saying that I am way too negative about the M2 MacBook Pro, specifically on Twitter. And now that I look back with everything that happened, I do think that I was pointing out a lot of the flaws and the findings that we were finding in our testing when we were testing all the different models and variations of the M2 MacBook Pro. So yes, I think I have been a little bit negative, so I'm gonna try to change that in the future to try to show more of the positive things, because there are positive things about the M2 MacBook Pro. Yes, the M2 chip is faster, especially for the graphics performance. It is a really big difference. In some of the tests we ran, 45% faster, and I did not talk about that much because I was focusing on some of the other issues that we were finding with the M2 MacBook Pro. And I actually got one tweet claiming that there was a laptop company that's probably paying me a big check to talk down on Apple and to talk down on the M2 MacBook Pro, which is obviously not true, because for many years people have been calling me an Apple fanboy, an Apple shill, and they've claimed that Apple is paying me money to talk good about Apple's MacBooks and overall products. And that's been happening ever since we started working for Apple Insider many years ago, covering all of these Apple products, and especially when Apple made the announcement of the transition to Apple Silicon. I was probably the biggest fan of Apple Silicon. I was telling people this is gonna be a revolution, that it's gonna end up killing x86, and everybody just laughed at me, said it's not true. There's no way these new A14X or M1 Max are gonna be that good. But then they came out and they ended up being amazing. So many people bought the M1 laptops, and we were recommending the M1 MacBook Air to basically everybody. And then we had the hype and the rumors for the M1X, which turned out to be M1 Pro and M1 Max, and I was saying that those are gonna be the best laptops ever made. And so many people called me an Apple fanboy. They said I have no idea what I'm talking about. And then the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pros came out and people were blown away. Apple really did a great job with those laptops. They made sure every part of it was a nice upgrade. And still to this day, there are people that are saying on Twitter that yes, this is the best laptop ever made. But now we have the M2 MacBook Pro, so let me start the story of everything that happened from the beginning. When we first got the M2 MacBook Pro in, we decided to do a benchmarks video, and within that video we actually tested the SSD, and we noticed that it was pretty slow compared to the previous M1 MacBook Pro model, and we pointed out that this could actually lead to slower virtual memory swap performance. Now, we didn't actually test that until the next day when we came in, we tested it out, and we saw, oh man, look at that, it is actually leading to worse performance. So we did a test where we compared it to the M1 MacBook Pro, and we noticed that if you have 10 Chrome tabs open, just 10 Chrome tabs, which is pretty common, I would say, we noticed that we were getting worse performance than the previous M1 MacBook Pro. And the reason that was happening was because these new M2 MacBook Pros, specifically the base model, which I would argue is very popular because that's mostly what Apple stores on their actual shelves in the Apple Store, as well as what's popular on Amazon. As you can see, it was ranked number 20 compared to the 512 gig model, which was ranked about 60 or 70. So the base model's more popular, but on that base model, it would only come with a single NAND chip instead of using up both of these spots, compared to the previous M1 MacBook Pro and the M1 MacBook Air, which would use both of those spots, which would end up giving you double the actual storage channels going to the storage controller, which would speed up the SSD SSD, and of course, if you're putting on a load of RAM, the system has to rely on the SSD performance to use as virtual memory swap, and that basically caused the M2 to be slower than the M1 in multiple tests, like exporting some basic photos, just 50 photos, while also having 10 Chrome tabs open, or doing the same thing, having 10 Chrome tabs and exporting a common 4K video. You would actually get a downgrade with the M2 machine, which I think is inexcusable, and I don't think it's right to be shipping a machine like this to somebody who thinks they're getting an awesome upgrade according to Apple's marketing, but really, in reality, they're experiencing worse performance than the previous M1 MacBook Pro. So we ended up getting a lot of requests in our comments asking for us to buy another 512 gig storage model that still has the same 8 gigs of RAM to just test the SSD differences alone, so we ended up doing that. And in our comparisons, we noticed that with no background apps open, no Chrome tabs, no other apps, nothing, the 512 gig model was 15% faster than the base model. That is a huge difference for just upgrading the storage, and let me say, we have never seen that before on any MacBook of the past, especially the Intel MacBooks. We've never seen a 15% jump just by upgrading the SSD. And then we ended up opening up some Chrome tabs and even Safari tabs, and yes, the base model got even slower, taking a lot longer than the 512 gig model. And then we ended up also testing the 512 gig storage and 16 gig RAM model of the M2 MacBook Pro, and that was even faster than the 512 gig 8 gig RAM model. So it's pretty clear that if you want to make the most out of the M2 chip and take Apple's marketing to the fullest and get the best performance, you want to upgrade both the storage and the RAM, which unfortunately brings you up to $1,700, which is only $100 away from the 14-inch MacBook Pro on Amazon, the sale price of $1,800. Now, in the past, with the M1 MacBook Pro, we didn't have those issues. The base models ran perfectly fine because they had 2 NAND chips for the SSD, so the virtual RAM swap worked great, and we could actually recommend the base models of the M1 Air and the M1 MacBook Pro with no issues. But with these M2 MacBook Pros, the base models with only 1 NAND chip, they do have a massive flaw, and I do not think that Apple should have gave it just a single chip. I think they should have eaten the loss and just give it the 2 NAND chips that the M2 chip needs to thrive and basically show off that performance gain that they marketed. So what we ended up doing in yesterday's video was compare the base M2 MacBook Pro for $1,300 to the M1 MacBook Air, which right now you can buy for only $900 on sale brand new, or even renewed on Amazon for around $800. So you could potentially save as much as $500 going with the M1 MacBook Air. And the findings we found were crazy because in a lot of the regular apps, the common apps that we tested, the M1 MacBook Air wasn't that much slower than the M2 MacBook Pro with nothing else open, no multitasking at all. But when we started to load just 5 Chrome tabs in the background, the M2 MacBook Pro was slower in every single test. Not only that, we ended up opening another app in the background, which is pretty common, I'd say, to have 5 tabs and an extra app running in the background. That's nothing crazy, that's nothing extreme, this is common use. We ended up showing some huge differences in the performance, but we also ended up going to the web browser during an export, which is pretty normal because if you're exporting video or you're exporting photos, you're not gonna sit there staring at it for a couple of minutes. You're gonna go browse the web just like normal people do, and we noticed that yes, the M2 MacBook Pro was less responsive when switching tabs than the M1 MacBook Air. So basically, if you're doing any kind of multitasking at all, the M1 MacBook Air was faster, and I think that is inexcusable from Apple to do that SSD setup with only 1 NAND chip, and I think it's a huge problem. But now I want to talk about the other issue, which I don't think is a big deal, but it ended up blowing up like crazy, and that is the whole thing with the thermal throttling. Well, we ended up testing the M2 MacBook Pro to the 14-inch M1 Pro MacBook Pro, and we decided to run some video editing tests, but we didn't want to run a bunch of them, so we did one easy test, which was the HEVC test, and we decided to do a hard test, one that we've done for years. We've done it with the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pros, we've done it with the Mac Pro, we did it with the Mac Studio. This is actually a real-world test that we've done in the past, so we wanted to test it on the M2 MacBook Pro, and we discovered some crazy results where we got up to 108 degrees Celsius, and the fan was maxed out at 7,200 RPM, so it basically couldn't keep itself cool, and it had to thermal throttle severely from an average package power of almost 30 watts down to 7 watts instantly, because that's the only way it could cool itself down. And the reason this happened with that test is because it fully maxes out the GPU and almost fully maxes out the CPU as well. So it's not relying on the encoders, and that's what makes it extreme, because if you're just running a 100% CPU workload, you're not gonna experience that thermal throttling. If you're just running a 100% GPU workload for graphics, you're not gonna experience it, and the average consumer is not gonna experience it as well. So when I made my Twitter thread about the severe thermal throttling, it ended up blowing up, and a lot of people ended up sharing it and not even reading the full thing, just reading the headline and going everywhere commenting that the M2 MacBook Pro has crazy overheating problems no matter what you do or in regular tasks, which is not true. I was showing off that one test where we saw the thermal throttling, and I made a big deal about it because the M1 MacBook Pro, there was no thermal throttling in that same test. We ran it and it was able to stay at 100% GPU nonstop, no throttling at all. And the 14-inch also had no thermal throttling. It didn't even have to max out the fans to cool it down. So unfortunately, that tweet ended up blowing up and people didn't read the context. They didn't read lower down when I said that this is an extreme test that a lot of people won't really be doing on the everyday. So most people will not run into this overheating problem. But my main point of that Twitter thread was that what is this gonna mean for the M2 MacBook Air that does not have any fan cooling at all? It's completely fanless. What's this gonna mean? Is it gonna thermal throttle under other workloads that are more realistic and more common? That was my point, but unfortunately everything went out of hand. I ended up replying and arguing, which I think I shouldn't have done. So I wanna say I'm gonna try to be less negative and try to be more peaceful on Twitter with all you guys. That's the change that I'm gonna try to make in the future. So with that said, I really wish that there was less attention on the thermal throttling thing, because I feel like everybody's talking about that because it's easier to refute that thermal throttling claim compared to the actual issue, the big issue with the M2 MacBook Pro, which is the single NAND chip, which is actually causing regular common workloads to be slower than the M1 MacBook Air, which I think should not happen under any circumstance whatsoever. No matter if it's 5 Chrome tabs, 10, multiple apps, this should not be happening at all. And that is what I wish Apple would address and respond to. And I really hope the M2 MacBook Air does not have that same issue. So there you guys go. That was my explanation of the M2 MacBook Pro Drama, straight from the heart, no teleprompter. And if you have any thoughts or questions on this, let me know down in the comment section below. And if you want to subscribe, go ahead and do that right there, because we are going to be testing the M2 MacBook Air in depth like we always do, actually running the real world tests instead of just sharing our opinion. And I think you guys value that. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.